Magic is found in every room, where people connect over a shared purpose. In this weekly podcast, Luke, Hannah and Chris explore the role of purpose, courage, mindset and culture in every leader's quest for transformational performance.
Hello and welcome to Magic in the Room. I am Hannah Broderud.
And I'm Luke Freeman. And today, if you can hear the birds chirping, we're at our awesome guest, Lorca Smetana's farm, 20 acres here on the west side of Bozeman. Lorca, thank you so much for hosting us today.
I'm so happy to have you here.
Okay, so we put all of our episodes on YouTube, and I would just say for people who are listening, like, if you're going to watch, this is the one, like, literally this second, I'm seeing a magpie flying across the field, cottonwood seeds blowing through the air. I can see the mountains, the breeze is blowing, there's wildflowers, and it's just beautiful.
And everything is so green. We're recording this in June, and it has rained all of June, so it is very virulent here.
Yeah, it's one of those why do I live in Tulsa days.
Why do you live in Tulsa, Luke?
You know, I love people there.
Yes.
So I want to give everyone background and then we'll jump in. So if this is your first listen, we are right in the middle of a season 4 that's all around intentional leadership. And what we mean by intentional leadership versus other types of leadership is just this practice, this habit of the mind in noticing things around us, things in the world that could be different, that could be better, making conscious choice to engage with those things, and then having the courage to actually act once we've consciously chosen what are my options and what could I do. So this notice, choose, act model we've talked about a lot. And this month, our focus is well-being. We've been talking about well-being, and that's what we're going to talk about to some degree with Lorca today until we get off on tangents. But
which we will.
Yeah. As a reminder, at magicintheroom.com, there's free downloads, reflection guides about well-being, and any other topic from previous months this season. Strongly encourage you to go download the guide on well-being and use that as a reflection guide for yourself as we work through this month. So
on magicintheroom.com?
Yep.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Luke. So, Lorca, it is wonderful to be back with you. And you've been on our podcast before in a previous season. And that was last season. It was one of the favorite episodes of that season. So here is for part 2.
Yeah, no pressure.
Yeah, no pressure.
But this better be one of the best ones this season.
Right? Well, I encourage our listeners to go find the episode on resilience with Lorca Smetana. And we can put the link to the episode in our show notes. So, Lorca, we are now here at your home in Bozeman, Montana, or a little bit outside of Bozeman. And what a peaceful place. What an amazing oasis in the world. I can't imagine a better place to be to practice resilience and well-being. Give us a little bit of background. You shared a little bit about your story last time you were here. Give us some, maybe the cliff notes of why do you care about this work, about well-being, about resilience, and how did you come to be here in this place?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So resilience is really interesting in that it's a function of hard things, right? We don't need it if there isn't something that we're adapting to or that is changing or that is hard. And so that was my first teacher of it, was something hard. So being finding myself as the survivor of a school tragedy, being involved in a mountaineering accident at my school when I was 16 years old, and simultaneously having both a real need to figure out how do I move forward from here? How do I climb out of something where I'm in grief and disbelief and non-functioning and, trauma, you know, for a long while, and at the same time, you know, wanting not to have to give up everything that life offers a human, right? Whether it's joy or building things or inventing things or healing or fixing or exploring. All of those things are things that that we can take for granted, but we can also just use them as our forward anchor. And so resilience became the name that I started calling that pathway, that process of building myself into somebody who could be both, that could hold really hard things and really amazing things at the same time in a life, because that's pretty much our life prediction, right? No one is ever going to be entirely above the line of well-being or entirely, well, it's possible, I guess, to be entirely below. But I believe that humans are fundamentally resilient because we are fundamentally a conduit of just life force. That given any balance at all and support, we're going to become more and more resilient.
Yeah.
And we can consciously feed that.
Yeah. And, you know, I don't know if you've read Dopamine Nation, but the author describes this function in our minds that's like a teeter-totter. And essentially, on one side is pleasure, on one side is pain. And if we are getting pleasure all the time, so shooting dopamine into our brains, pleasure, 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 that's pushing down one side of the teeter-totter, our bodies will actually create the anti-fun chemicals that push down on the other side and try and achieve balance. And so then say we take away our dopamine input, you know, we stop scrolling, we stop, you know, whatever it was that we were doing, then there's so much weight built up on the other side that we do feel those feelings of depression, pain, you know, all of those hard things. But it works in the opposite way as well, which I think is what you're getting at with this idea that we're built to be resilient. If we experience hard things and there's so much weight on that side of the teeter-totter, our bodies will actually start to produce more and more of these moments, like these chemicals released, to try and create some balance. And so systemically, physiologically, we both are at play. And even if we're not conscious of it, our body is trying to experience both, trying to experience hard things in life and be aware of them, right? We need to be aware of them for our survival. We need to manage hard things. And trying to be aware of pleasure and seek pleasure. So I might have butchered the science there, but I think that's a 80% accurate reflection there. But yeah.
I love the chemistry of that. I mean, yes, I really want to go look into that further. I think we make a common error where we suppress certain emotions and with the idea that's a good system. Yeah. But fundamentally, I think any emotions that we suppress or persuade ourselves into or out of doesn't have a function of shifting. The function it has is it numbs. I think we can't numb negative emotions without also numbing our capacity for joy. Right. And so it's problematic. And from my stance, it creates a fragility. Yeah. Right? A numb system is prone to certain kinds of injury and error that a more responsive system isn't.
Yeah. Wow. That's a whole big idea right there. We could
Let's just skip to the takeaways for today. Okay. Yeah. So I am curious because we talked about resiliency last time, and resiliency as a topic has kind of had its moment in the sun the last few years. I don't know how you've experienced that as a resiliency expert, but one thing that I've noticed trending recently is sort of some anti-resiliency narrative around like, well, people are telling us we need to be resilient, but like, stop shitting on me all the time and I don't have to be resilient. Like, why is there so much pain? And are you just trying to pacify me by saying you should be resilient rather than saying, no, we should have less pain in some of the systems in which we live in our world. So I'm curious, you probably know a lot more about some of those trending and conversations than I do. Like, what's your take and thoughts?
Yeah. Actually, I don't know a whole lot about it that end, but I have thoughts. So the first one is, yes, that is fundamentally a question of justice, right? Because and it's the co-opting in some cases of the word resilience to use towards someone's own ends, which generally I'm likely involve trying to hold on to control in one way or another, right? And ultimately, that's a non-resilient system. That if the soil is poisoned, then what grows from it is not going to be healthy, and it's not the fault of the plant, right? So the resilience, as I understand it, is never having to make a choice between justice and resilience, number one. And number two, that for me, resilience is always an invitation to go deeper. And the problems there are caused by, I think, a very shallow definition of resilience, which is things are okay, right? And they seem okay from my point of view, and so we shouldn't mess with it. Whereas real resilience says, if you only treat surface things, you're inviting drama. You are inviting pushback. You're inviting problems down the road, right? So the real invitation is to say, look, you might have a resilient or what feels like a healthy system right here. If it is when it is enclosed by larger unhealthy systems, then it is not sustainable. Yeah. So your invitation is always to look into the larger picture, which gets you out of the fallacy of that resilience is a function of one, right? It is always connected to everything else.
Yeah, that's very helpful because, I think about an organization that says, hey, should we do a resiliency workshop for our staff? People are stressed. It feels like, and I hesitate to boil things down to a rule of thumb, but it feels like maybe a helpful question to ask is, are we only talking about resilience as a response to acute stressors? I got a flat tire, my spouse is sick. And in that case, sure, that's helpful and great. Or are we really interested in talking about resilience and what are the chronic stressors? And some of those might be part of our design as an organization that we need to give people a chance to talk about. And that's two different ways. I'm hearing you say, like, two different domains of resilience or ways to talk about resilience.
What I think of as resilience design is preemptive resilience. How do we refill before the water is needed to pour out, right? Yeah. And if you consistently are doing that, then it's a very different conversation.
Yeah. So I think that's a great segue to get a little bit more specific about well-being, which I think is a function of, or maybe the way to fill the well, or one of the ways. So how would you define well-being when you think about it?
Actually, one of the ways in which I think of it actually is very embodied, right? In the sense that, and it's very self-defined in the moment. So, for example, if you asked me or if I asked you, like if there's a horizontal line of well-being, and at any one moment you are above it or below it to some degree, right? So right after the Mount Hood accident that I was in, very far below the line of well-being. Yeah. But with also, supports that were already bringing me back, really amazingly warm, tight community, and physical health, and, all the other things that are relevant. And And at the same time, if I asked you right now and said, are you above or below the line, you'd answer me right there, right? And, we can be definitely amazing at fooling ourselves by saying, I'm fine. We're like, that's a stoic, habitual, culturally supported narrative that I have to teach people how to really check in sometimes. But fundamentally, though, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's part of it, is that not only part of being resilient is not only being able to answer that question, but asking yourself on a very regular basis,
yes,
right? Above or below the line right now, right? And how far above, how far below, what's happening in the next few minutes, day, that is going to affect where I locate myself in that particular measure. Mm-hmm. So that I really am not arcane about this. I really like people to just do a full body check-in. Yeah. And
can we talk about embodiment for a minute? Because we were talking about this beforehand as we were just preparing and chatting and catching up. And one of the things that you said was, we were talking about different aspects of resiliency and well-being, and embodiment as one of those. You said something like, this one is so often overlooked and it's in a weird spot right now culturally. Our culture in particular doesn't do well. So I'm curious for listeners, like,
and by our culture, you're talking about
United
about
States, all the Norwegians,
Western culture. No, I mean, I'm part of Western culture too, and I'm part of American culture. No, but I don't know where all of our listeners are. They could be in Asia.
That's the one thing we know is where they are, and mostly they're in the United States. So
for now,
mostly they're in the United States. And for those of you in Europe and India and Australia, like, thank you so much for joining us, and give us feedback if we need to pay more attention to you. But so what is embodiment? Like, just simple definition, and like, how does that show up in day-to-day kind of self-management?
Yeah. Embodiment it's the ocean that the fish is swimming in all the time, right? And we are fundamentally, inescapably embodied, right? And our bodies are extraordinarily, fabulously complex, responsive, intricate. They're really, really amazing and extraordinary, and we're learning more all of the time how they work. And so there are ways of being with hard things that used to be, that outside of Western cultures are built in, right? Mm-hmm. Or accepted or acknowledged, or right? So that we have actually removed ourselves from in all sorts of ways, making us more fragile, right? In how we can respond to trauma as mammals, okay? Mm-hmm. So if we start from that point of view and we say, all right, I want to be more, I want to harness the full available power that everybody has. Mm-hmm. I want to key back into it. I want to get really curious about it. You can start several different places. And one of them is just recognizing a certain kind of quality of a moment that I love, which is kind of the I told you so moment that your body does, where you might have an amazing insight, right? Or you might have an incident that happens that suddenly makes you open up and realize, like, oh, this is what's real. This is this is the truth. Mm-hmm. And if you asked your body in that moment, your body would say, I've been trying to tell you. Yeah. Like, your body is not surprised. And so you're like, whoa, what if I start welcoming my body back into the conversation table of decision making? Who do I listen to? Who's my inner consultative table, right? My counsel. And the body has been at the table all along, but in so many cases, it is just shut down, that after a while, it just leans back and folds its arms, says, I'm not even going to try. Mm-hmm. Like, why am I going to say anything? I'm just going to get ignored or silenced or whatever. And there have been some amazing people writing about and speaking about all of this. one of whom actually is Eve Ensler, is amazing on this front. But it is something where you don't actually have to go out and to get other people, right? You can start to get really curious about how different experiences show up physically in me, right? I can say, well, okay, I'm starting, and you can start either with an emotion and ask yourself, how does that emotion showing up in my body? Or you can start with your body sensation and start looking for patterns, right? So I have, like, some people might say, oh, I get itchy palms when, right? Or someone else might say, I'm feeling really resentful, and like that shows up in my chest, or in tension in my neck, or I lose feeling in my extremities, or I've got sparks shooting up my fingertips, or like all the full menu of sensation, right? Is what we're getting really curious about. And it can lead us down these amazing pathways. I mean, this is the pathway of a radically accelerated understanding of and healing from PTSD, was through somatic, all the somatic modalities and therapies. I am a result of that, and through somatic work with some really marvelous people, I am at a place of healing from Mount Hood that I realized that I had kind of accepted that I never would get there. Wow. That I had on some level thought, well, it's possible that I'm in some ways broken for life. Wow. And I'm not. No. Yeah. So, I mean, that's magical, right? Yeah. Never forgetting that. But also, really coming into a new friendship with your body, where your body is so, like, if your body was a friend, it would be, a really curious one, and a fun and a cool one, and one who never stops getting tired of you, and always has like a new thing to contribute. And when we make full body decisions, right? When we invite all those voices into the table, our bodies, our guts, our hearts, our minds, spirit, really the protectors, all the voices, right? Mm-hmm. Then we make wiser, more grounded decisions that have more elegant and beautiful consequences. Mm-hmm. And it fundamentally adds health to the biology of a mammal.
Yeah. I think for folks listening, if you're a typical North American, in your head, science, cognitive, person, The Body Keeps the Score is a great place to start. That's a good book that, from a scientific kind of cognitive perspective, really breaks down some of these ideas. And so I think it's a great intro place that has some very practical examples and also practices that you can try.
Yeah. So Lorca, when you talk about, this is a phrase that really stood out to me, creatively resilient thinking and radical self-care. Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that?
So that fundamentally, well, I'm just thinking first about that word creatively, mm-hmm. right? Fundamentally, resilience is creative. It occurs as an experience of creativity. Yeah. And the more creative you are in the more arenas of your life, the more you become more resilient. Mm-hmm. They're inextricably entwined. And that expressiveness that you make more and more space for, mm-hmm. that you allow more, that you invite more, mm-hmm. Starts to have an impact on how you shape the spaces around you, mm-hmm. how you walk into a room with a brand new situation and are incredibly open to all the possibilities, right? Rather than that you let go of control, that you let go of vanity, mm-hmm. that you invite failure on a really and track it. I track failure in my week.
Interesting.
Pretty regularly. failure and risk is another one.
Yeah.
So that I regard those as measures of resilience. Not in the sense that I have to obsessively have everything all tracked down, but if I were to sit down for even, a few minutes and say, so can I think of any times this week in which I was risking, inventing, failing? Like if I can't, then I'm like, oh, that's a problem. Can I do that in a week and be fine? Yeah. But can I do that for week after week after week and not have missed some real boats that set sail without me, in terms of what could be built? Yeah, I don't think so.
Yeah, this a real simple kind of rule for me, and that we talk about around our house is creating versus consuming. It's nice to have the little C alliteration piece. I learned that from Chris King, who's been on the podcast a few times and is a therapist. And that's that rule, like, are we spending more time creating versus consuming, or is it at least balanced out, or have I had any of either of those? Has been really helpful, for my kids as we think about, okay, yeah, there's lots of fun things that we can do. Are any of them creating? Because the world right now is full of things that seem really positive and full of pleasure, but are essentially consuming. And what I hear you saying is that without that balance, without some sort of exercise of the creating side, that our energy gets stuck a little bit.
A lot. Right? And it is inherently tied to discomfort. My mentor and teacher, he died on Mount Hood. He's my climbing leader, but he taught physics and philosophy and mathematics and ethics, and he used to say, "You think you have problems? I'm a priest and a physicist."
Yeah, that sounds complicated.
And he had a sign on the back of his door that was a quotation by, oh shoot, dang it, I'm drawing it. I'll pull it out in just a second. But it essentially said, "Adventure is an attitude towards discomfort." And
ooh, I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that which is very different from no pain, no gain. Right. But in order to be creative, in order to be adventurous, in order to be in our bodies, we have to have an invitation to ourselves to keep nudging out our capacity to stay, to recognize, am I uncomfortable or am I in danger? And if I'm just uncomfortable, can I stay here just a little longer? And then what happens there, right? And if we can do that, then we avoid this reflex dive back into safety, into comfort.
Yeah.
And we find ourselves in new territory, right? This is the wilderness that is inside all of us, just waiting to be ventured into and played with. But you can't. You have to beware of building up too much of a reflex to numb, right? So, and it can look like a lot of really great things, right? It can look like things which we recognize as problematic, right? Oh, I'll just go check my email, or oh, I'll just have another glass of wine, or oh, I'll pick up my phone, or whatever. But it can also look like other things, which is, oh, I'll go weed the onions back over here down in the garden instead of inventing a medieval garden that I want to build and working on what that would look like, right? Or I can choose something that is beautiful, productive, and tame consistently, persistently, or I can stay with that discomfort, which is not going to show up necessarily in your brain. you get to know it in your body.
Yeah.
Right? I can feel it, even just talking about it. I can feel, it feels like the outsides of my arms are really activated at this moment. And my little fingers are kind of, I'm like, okay, I'm there. Right? And like, do I feel like I have enough bandwidth to dive in and be brave, and in a time when actually it doesn't necessarily feel hugely like bravery. It just feels like, okay, I'm going to do the thing. Right? And, or, I might say, no, I'm tapped out right now. I actually really just need to go and weed for a while and refill in that way. And then when I'm more full, then I'll go after the big stuff. But if it's not that you can't do both, but if you always do one or the other, then there's some questions there.
Yeah.
All right. So we've talked a little bit about embodiment. We've talked about radical or creative, resilient thinking, radical self-care. Why, and I'm going to ask a question, when we talked about this before we started recording, you had almost a visceral reaction to the question of why should we give time to our own well-being and care?
Yeah. Because, yes, very visceral response to that.
Yeah.
You think we shouldn't? Why should we? We shouldn't. Just get done what you have to get done.
For me, it almost shows up along the lines of saying, why shouldn't I, tie rocks to my ankles as soon as I wake up in the morning and walk around, right? This is a function of commitment and caring, not to myself, which is the ultimate, that's the thing we have the most control over.
Yeah.
Right? This thing that I have, that I'm inside, is the thing where I have the most agency and the most fine-tunable action. Right? I can control what's happening here, or influence, let's say that.
Yes.
What's happening here on a very fine-tuned level if I want to. But at the same time, we can say that we are not, okay, I'm just going to say this. I don't believe that we can ethically say that we care about something and not fundamentally meet the needs of the thing that's going to go do it.
Yeah.
And so for someone to say, I have a business and I'm all about it being really successful and doing well, or I have a family that I care about, like my child means everything to me. I care about the water quality in my city, right? And you're like, okay, I'm giving myself to the service of this.
Yeah.
I'm putting myself on the table, saying that this is important and that I'm out there in the world doing something. And then you don't tend the most fundamental needs that will let you be there for the long haul. That is logically problematic and functionally fragile. And so this doesn't make anyone evil. And I really believe that the way that the human brain works, it invites us over and over and over again. And not just our brain, our entire neurological system invites us over and over again to try to be safe in the ways that it knows best.
Right.
And those are not always what is functional long-term. And so it invites us again and again to focus, try to be safe, try to avoid change, try to keep my ego okay, try to protect what I think is mine. And all of those are also invitations to avoid, to withdraw, to numb. And so resilience takes clear seeing, it takes courage, it takes humor, it takes the persistent letting go of another layer of vanity. And it needs to have a great deal of ease and play built in, because if it is hard, someone who needs it most can't do it. So it has to have functional on-ramps in every at every stage where people can re-enter all the time.
So you're saying a butcher that really cared about creating fine cuts of meat would sharpen their knives?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a really interesting way to think about it. You know, ourselves being our primary tool to fulfill our purpose and to care for the things around us. And it's interesting because there is this irony that oftentimes the people who do seem to care the most neglect themselves, which is the primary tool that they would need to actually deliver care.
There is a segment of my work, and always will be, that is recovery, right? That is building people back up who are astounding, phenomenally generous, and who didn't hold well themselves. Well, I'll just say resilience, one of my favorite definitions of it is well-being through time.
Right.
And so they gave themselves in their zones of genius, in the ways that only they can serve the world.
Mm-hmm.
And but at personal cost that now is also costing themselves and everything around them and all of us. Right? And so how do we rebuild the system that they are so that they can do that again in the new way, and the world will then be given what it so badly needs. Right? Yeah.
All right, so let's talk practically speaking. What can people do? How do we do this? How do we build well-being and resilience?
Okay. All right. So love this. Absolutely. Which first? I have 3 things that went, me. So the first one is understanding the difference between real and not real or less real compassion.
Oh.
Okay. And I feel like this is a really important, learnable, teachable thing, because people, I think compassion is, here's irony. People are making themselves so wrong for not having enough self-compassion.
Right. Yeah.
So, but that's because no one's ever taught us how do you know if it's working or not, right? It's like someone gave you a car and you don't know whether the engine is hooked up to it. So here's how you know. And if you practice this in small ways, in little low-stakes things, then it just becomes your eventual default. So the first thing, get really curious about the current situation. And so there's 3 parts to functional compassion. And learn it first as self-compassion inwards. Then you can also apply these equally when you're applying compassion outwards. A lot of people are better at outward than inward.
Yep.
So you might find that outward you actually do all these 3 steps, whereas inward you skip 1 or 2 or all 3. So it's just the first thing you do is do a survey through a week or so, figure out what is the situation for me right now. So the 3 parts are, the first one is being able to say that it hurt, right? Acknowledging the realness of the suffering.
Yeah.
Be able to say that hurt, that sucked, that made me feel bad, that's not okay, I'm not okay. All of those, are the opposite of I'm fine. And so practice that, right? And when I say self-compassion, this is not instead of whatever action you're ultimately going to take.
Right.
This is before.
Yeah.
Right? Or even retroactively. But, you do it. And it says, so the first one is oof, right? Second one says, wow, I'm really normal, right? That you are normalizing the response you had to a crappy situation, right? Or an incident, or a saying boy, that was sure human of me to feel this way,
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're not judging yourself for your response.
Mm-hmm.
You're saying, and you know that by asking yourself, has any other human in the history of the world, ever had a similar situation and responded, that way too? And if the answer is yes, you're like, yep, I'm human. Okay, so normalizing. And then the third one is just add kindness at that point.
Yeah.
And it can look like anything, right? You can add like lightening another burden temporarily. It can look like deciding you're going to call your best friend this weekend. It can look like setting a boundary. It can look, any of the ways in which you can add kindness. And then if you're applying it to somebody else, same thing. And in fact, it's a great illustration. Like if your friend came up and said, right? And you said, I'm sorry, like that hurts. Like you wouldn't deny their pain. Mm-hmm. And then the second thing you wouldn't do would be like, God, you're weird. I've never heard of anybody else who's ever like that, or you're weak, or you're whatever it is, right? And then the third one, you just walk away. No, right? No. You're like, you put your hand on their shoulder, or you say, I have, cakes and ale, or whatever it is, or let's walk, or any kind of way, right? Those are those three pieces. So that is a really beautiful entryway into self-care. I have a couple of redefinitions of self-care in the last year or so.
Let's hear 'em.
Yeah, that I really enjoy a lot and use on a very practical basis. And the first one is to say, self-care is not a prescription from anybody else, ever. And I started thinking about this because I started getting bugged by, there's all those articles, right? Yeah. About like, you should, entire magazines full of self-care. Mm-hmm. And if those magazines were taken as like, here are some options, sure, that's one thing. Yeah. But instead they're like, here's what you have to do in order to be caring for yourself. So the more useful and real, functionally real way to think of self-care is as a repeated question, which is you ask yourself or somebody else, right? Again, what is the real need? What is your real need right now? What is your real need? And in that moment, the answer may be something like a bubble bath, right? Which is a magazine response. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Bubble baths are awesome, but they are not prescriptive, and they are not universal, and they are not available. And so the what it really comes down to is saying, what is my real need? And that could be, I need to get the hell out of here right now. My real need is, I need food. I need to hydrate. I need someone who is good at this thing that I am not good at, so that I can be doing what I am good at, right? I need to move my body. I need to speak truth to someone. All of those might be answers of real need. And when you dial down with real need, it's worth asking a few times the question, like, what's my need? Like, I need this. I'm like, okay, really, what do you need? really, what do I need? Yeah. And at that point, you are 100 times closer to taking an action that is powerful or effective, or that is what I would think of as true self-care. And so that's a very good starting point for someone. I love the idea of deep and shallow filters.
Okay.
So looking at parts of your life and saying, so what shows up in my life as a deep self-care and shallow self-care? What is deep pleasure and shallow pleasure? What is deep healing and shallow healing? What's deep play, shallow play? And it's not that any of those is wrong, but if very large amounts of your answers are in the shallow, like what's deep work, shallow work, right? Then that may be an invitation into making some changes that make you a lot more grounded and happy. Deeper. And and then the second redefinition is one that just delights me. And it is reframing the phrase self-care into self-honoring.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And because, and I think this came up originally in a conversation around boundaries, right? Like, I need to set boundaries to have real boundaries, and that's good self-care, which can be 100% true. However, there are a lot of ways in which we can self-honor that don't involve putting up a wall. And putting up a wall is a problematic habit to begin with, right? Because then you sometimes have to take them down because you find what you really want is on the other side. And we build armor up inside and around ourselves in so many ways. We are so supported in that culturally and I think neurobiologically, and yet we can build up a corresponding practice of taking down walls, testing them, and saying, do I still need this? Because walls are rigid and walls are disconnecting. And so when I ask something about if there's a friendship, right, or if there's a relationship or a state of health even, asking the question of what would be self-honoring here might come up with a much greater breadth of invitations than just the idea that I have to, right? That phrase again.
Yeah.
I should. Do certain things, and instead we end up with a really beautiful panorama of thresholds that we can step across and test.
Wow, there's so much here, and I know we could keep talking for hours, and I would like to continue the conversation. As we kind of start to wrap up here, this has been such a rich and colorful and vivid conversation. I want to go back and listen to it again and draw out all the goodness. But let's do a little bit of a quick kind of key takeaways. Luke, what are some things that have really stood out to you today in the conversation?
I'm interested in this idea of self-honoring versus self-care. And, on the one hand, maybe the cynical or practical side of me is like, 6 of one, half dozen of the other. It's just a different word. But I think words are powerful. And when I think about the word honor, I think it's challenging. Honor requires attention, and it's also an attitude of heart and perspective towards something that's different than just care. I care about a lot of things. I don't know that I honor many. Like, what are the things in life that I really honor or feel a sense of honor towards? Like I'm indebted to them, or I'm exist on some level to serve them. It's not many. And so, but I think it works for self to some degree. So yeah, that's my takeaway. I'm going to be chewing on that for a while, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. For me, just this reminder to use a phrase I've heard you use in the past, checking in below the neck. Because we're up here all the time. Check in below the neck. That's really when you say embodiment, being in tune with your body. And thanks for the reminder, Luke, to read The Body Keeps the Score. It's in my reading list, and I think I'm going to pull it out after this conversation. So yeah, that's what I'm going to go back and get back into a practice or continue to take steps towards embodiment and checking in below the neck.
Yeah. Another book that might be really useful in that conversation would be My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem.
Okay.
And that is both deeply personal, but also takes it out more even into the social context.
I love it. My Grandmother's Hands. I'm going to have to look that one up.
Yeah.
We'll put a link in our show notes as well.
I think, in a lot of ways, there's a word that's showing up that we've been circling. I've been circling around. But a great deal of this all comes back to integrity.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we persistently self-honor, when we are in alignment between what we say, how we respond, how we act, when we put the work in to heal where we know we're broken, first, preemptively, to the best of our ability, so that we can be out in the world in the cleanest way possible. All of these come back to being a person of integrity, and which is fundamentally a person who is whole. And I love these ways in which I love the separations that we can do within our own selves and separate ourselves into different pieces so that we get to know the pieces and ultimately experience ourselves as whole.
Oh, I love that.
Because everyone's at the table at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
invite all the parts, but you have to know them in order to do that.
And someone who is whole is, to me, a fundamental natural leader, a radiant leader, radiant in the sense of setting off light, right? And radiant in the sense that there is no directionality to how this person is a leader. They are fundamentally being relational in the world and affecting what is happening in every direction around them, whether it's above or below or across to the sides. And that, if I want to create leaders, I would add wholeness.
Yeah.
In fact, I want to create leaders and I add wholeness.
I love that. No, that's
what I do.
Yeah, I think this echoes back to, we've talked on the podcast before about, and this is from an organizational context. So for a senior leadership team, there is a moral or ethical aspect to the question of what do we outsource and what do we really need to take care of on our own. And, we've talked before about, like, if someone's outsourcing their morality, hey, tell me about is it safe for a diverse population to work here? Like, tell me how I should word that. Well, like, probably a piece of your personality / morality as an organization that you shouldn't just pay someone else to tell you what the words are. Like, you should grapple with that on your own. And I say all of that to say this idea of taking ownership of our own well-being, like, it's something that we shouldn't outsource. And if we read a list and bubble bath is on there, like, that's okay. But ultimately, this is one of those core issues. Our own well-being is a core issue that can't be outsourced. And if we find ourselves consistently trying to outsource it to a family member, to a team member, to a book, to this podcast, like, probably something you should in-house work on.
Yeah, it adds fragility. I love that way of phrasing it. Thank you. Yeah. No, I completely agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, great takeaways. Lorca, if someone wants to connect with you, learn from you, learn more about your work. I know you're hosting a retreat out here at the farm in the fall for your current students and your community that you work with. How can people connect with you and your work?
Yeah. So these days I'm working with both individuals and organizations and teams. And so some of it is recovery work. And then the flip side of recovery work is leadership work. The tools are all the same. It just depends whether you're above or below the line of well-being. So working one-on-one coaching, I get to do full-day retreats here on the farm, where someone comes and we play for a whole day on resilience skills. That's one of my favorite things to do. And then going out and working within organizations. And I just came back this week from working with the leadership of the Montana Department of Corrections. And I got to say, just throw it in there, I am really impressed by the work that organization is doing within themselves. Really amazing. Yeah, really, I mean, the level of caring and communication that's happening is going to be fascinating to watch. Yeah. So those are my big play zones right now. Yeah. And getting to work both, with people across the world, but also finally getting to work again in person I just am treasuring every time.
Yes, of course. What's a good website if somebody wants to look you up? And
it's my full name. It's lorcasmetana.com.
Great.
Yeah.
All right. So thank you so much for being here today and sharing wisdom with us. For our listeners, a reminder that you can download a reflection guide to this series on well-being, as well as the other topics that we've been talking about this season on magicintheroom.com. You can find Purpose and Performance Group on our website, purposeandperformancegroup.com. We're also on all the social media outlets, specifically LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram are the channels we use the most. Magic in the Room is hosted by Chris Province, Hannah Broderud, and Luke Freeman. It is produced by Ben West. Social media management by Emma Holland and Michael Manfredi. Our theme music is by Evan Grimm, and you can find his music on Apple Music. This episode was recorded on location outside of Bozeman, Montana, on the farm of the Smetanas. Magic in the Room is a production of Purpose and Performance Group. Find us at purposeandperformancegroup.com, and you can find previous episodes at magicintheroom.com.